Hello and welcome back to another Mr. Farney Earth Science video. Here is part of our geologic time unit. In the previous video, we introduced geologic time. We looked at the timeline itself. We spoke briefly about the two largest chunks of time, or the two eons of time that encompass the entire geologic time scale, the Precambrian and the Phanerozoic. In two videos from now, we'll go into much more detail about the specifics of which events occurred in each of those eons. But for now, we'll backburner that and have a little bit of a discussion about how scientists actually understand the sequence that led to those conclusions by looking at rock layers and determining the ages of rock layers relative to each other. And that's what we're getting at with this video, is we're going to talk about relative age dating. This is how scientists use specific geologic principles to learn the sequence in which geologic events have occurred. So we're going to talk about several different principles to help us understand what order rock layers formed in, and then a couple vocab words to discuss what happened between rock layers that lead scientists to ask questions like, why is this rock layer tilted? Is one missing? Things of that nature. So this is a very vocabulary dense video that's going to warrant you to go back and maybe watch it a second time. So please pay attention, follow along in your notes, and here we go. So relative age dating is this idea of uniformitarianism. That's a big old word that means that the present is the key to the past. This uniformity in the rocks let geologists know what was going on in the past by following specific principles. To keep it simple, by putting geologic events in order which they occurred, we call that relative age dating. The first principle that we need to kind of recognize is called original horizontality. What does that mean? It means that sedimentary rock layers are deposited flat or horizontal. So sedimentary rocks, and we'll learn this when we do geology in January, sedimentary rocks, when they're deposited, they're originally deposited flat, like they are in this second picture on the bottom here. First is letter A, then letter B, letter C, and then letter D, the oldest at the bottom, the youngest at the top. Now, different things could happen to these flat layers after they've been deposited. Like, look at the top picture. They all kind of tilted a little bit. Geology, we don't call it tilting, we call it folding. So regardless if we're looking at a folded picture or an unfolded picture, the idea of original horizontality is that sedimentary rocks are deposited horizontal. They're originally deposited flat. That's original horizontality. The next one, law of superposition, it adds on to that, where not only are they deposited flat, but the law of superposition states that in a sequence of undisturbed sedimentary rocks, the oldest will be at the bottom, like the red layer here, and the youngest rocks will be at the top. So that's combining now two laws that we have, or two ideas. The first one being original horizontality, that sedimentary rocks are deposited horizontal first, and then this law of superposition that the oldest are at the bottom, the youngest are at the top. So you can see we're just going to keep slowly building in rules and principles and laws that we have to follow to figure out how old these rock layers are. The last one of these three is called the principle of cross-cutting relationships. This is when you have an intrusion that is cutting through layers of rock, and that intrusion is considered younger. When we learned intrusive features in volcanism, these intrusive features could be batholiths, they can be stocks, dikes, laccoliths, sills. All those fun intrusive features are younger than the material they're cutting through. So if I looked at this picture here, my intrusions, or the things that are cutting across the other layers, are letter G. It kind of looks like a dike, it's very skinny. Or in letter I here, it's much more wider, cutting across. I'd say that's probably a stock, if I had to guess there. But G and I, those are cutting across the other layers. So they are younger than whichever layers they are cutting through. So that's the principle of cross-cutting relationships. Intrusions are younger than the rocks it cuts across. So if I were to look at this picture and I were to say which is younger, letter B or letter I, Layer B or layer I would say I, because I know that intrusions are younger than the rocks it cuts across. It's almost like they're kind of stacked on top of each other if you were to cut this out of paper. So letter I, this intrusion that's probably a stock is cutting across this letter B layer here of some sedimentary rock. So I is younger than B. Same thing with letter G here. If I were to compare B to G, G is cutting straight across letter B. So G is younger than B. That is the principle of cross-cutting relationships. The last one, and this one we're not going to talk too much about. This is the principle of inclusions. So try not to get inclusion confused with intrusion. Two I words sound very similar. Intrusion has to do with magma cross-cutting rocks. Inclusion means you're including rock layers from the layer next to it in a different layer. What does that mean? Well, if you look at this, we have three layers here, rhyolite, basalt, and sandstone. And it looks like we have little chunks of rock from the layer below in a different layer. So if I look at this rhyolite layer here, you can see we have basalt, little basalt rocks or little basalt inclusions included in that layer. So if I were to age these inclusions, I know they come from the layer below, so they're older than the rhyolite. So I would say that the basalt inclusions are older than the rhyolite layer. We can begin to see how this can be confusing, so that's why you want to take these one at a time. So that's a lot of info right there, so let's rewind real quick. Original horizontality, layers are deposited flat. That's one. Law of superposition, old at the bottom, young at top. Principle of cross-cutting, intrusions are younger than the rocks it cuts across. And inclusions, when we have those pieces, they must be older than the rock layer that contains them. So all of these principles are seen in this picture here. So if I were to ask you a question such as, what is the youngest layer on this diagram? What would you say? If you said Y, then you're correct, because Y is cross-cutting everything in this diagram. So that's telling me that that Y, following the principle of cross-cutting relationships, is younger than everything it's cutting through, and it's cutting through everything. Conversely, if I were to say, what is the oldest rock here, what would you say? I would probably say letter A here. Because remember, all sedimentary rock is originally deposited flat before it decides to fold. So this letter A here, probably the oldest. So that's kind of the direction we're going with this. I'll let you pause for a second to think. Here's a picture of geologists looking at all these things too. You can see some folding going on in the rocks. You can see different layers, different types of material, all that fun stuff. And the folds are even in different directions. Very interesting. Okay. The second piece of information, now that we have the base rules, is what if something happens to a layer that goes against these rules? Well, we call these unconformities, where you have something going on to our horizontal sedimentary layers that's creating like a question for scientists or a missing piece of information. So an unconformity is some buried surface of erosion. You're missing rock layers. Something's going on that's causing a missing of rock layers. And there's different types. The first one is called a disconformity. Now this one is simple. It's when you have a horizontal layer over top of another horizontal layer, but it's not completely flat. So looking at this picture, we can see if we look at the green horizontal layer and this kind of yellow brick, it's not totally flat like the other layers. There's some bumping going on, and something went on here in this area before the green layer was deposited to make it not completely flat. So maybe there was some type of erosion that happened to my brick layer here that made it not completely flat at the top before that green layer was deposited in. So a disconformity, that is a disconformity right there, where there is something off between two horizontal rock layers, probably erosion. The second one is a nonconformity. where you have a horizontal sedimentary layer being deposited over non-sedimentary rock. So a nonconformity here, it looks like we have some sort of magma intrusion that cross-cut a whole bunch of layers. And then maybe there was a bunch of erosion that happened. Maybe this came to the surface through uplifting. Regardless, we have this non-horizontal layer, but then on top of it, we have like this horizontal orange that's coming in, filling in some gaps, this horizontal yellow that's coming in, filling in some gaps, then this brown, then this pink, and then we have the surface. So we have these horizontal layers that are being deposited on top of non-sedimentary rock. That's a non-conformity. So we have a disconformity that's probably from erosion. We have a non-conformity. And then the last one is an angular unconformity, is where we have horizontal layers that are deposited over tilted sedimentary layers here. So how are easy ways to remember all of this? Well, a disconformity is sedimentary on sedimentary. Nonconformity is sedimentary on top of some rock that's not sedimentary. An angular unconformity is you have a horizontal layer on top of one of our tilted sections. So these are going to take some doing to get you to kind of remember the differences between these. So that way, if you saw a picture like this one in the slides and I asked you what type of unconformity this is, you would say, oh, well, I have these tilted layers, and then on top of them is deposited some flat layers. So I know that's angular unconformity. So it's going to take some time for us to take these unconformities, combine them with the principles we learned at the beginning, so we can really fully understand what's going on here in this picture. Now, if you look at this picture, we have a ton of these things going on. We have our angular unconformity right here. We have these layers that are tilted, A, B, C, D, E, and F. They've been tilted. We have a disconformity because if you look at letter I, it's not completely flat with letter J. We have intrusions, these cross-cutting. We have X's, we have Y's, we have non-conformities because of the intrusion. So we can have a lot of adjectives and descriptive words now to describe these rock layers in determining the order in which they occurred and possible mechanisms that cause some of these weird behaviors to then come into play. So again, this video will take maybe some reviewing. Watch this more than once, more than twice, whatever it takes so we have a really basic understanding and a strong basic understanding of these different principles and then the rules with unconformities. In class, we're going to work through some rock identifying activities where we identify rock layers and the order in which they go in. So please make sure you do your best job on that so you have a really strong understanding of the sections for our geologic time unit. I feel this is the most difficult, is getting these rules down for rock layers and unconformities. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. So that's the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about a more specific way to gauge how old material is. It's called absolute dating. And we'll talk a little bit about how fossils are formed and the conditions needed to make sure we have really strong, well-preserved fossil material. So again, if you have any questions for me, please go ahead and let me know. If not, I will see you back in the next video. Take care.